Good afternoon, distinguished participants. Welcome to the third session of the fourth UN Responsible Business and Human Rights Forum. My name is Romchat Wachiraratanakornkul from Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, and I will be your moderator for this session, Environmental Defenders as Levers of Change, Supporting Climate Action and Responsible Business Practice. While we are gathering together here in Bangkok, many countries in our region are facing climate calamities. Japan is battered by one of the worst super typhoon in countries has ever seen. 9 million people have been told to evacuate from homes. Transport and business have been disrupted, and the country is faced by the extensive flooding and landslide. In South Asia, 33 million people in Pakistan have been underwater for 2 months. Homes, roads, crops, livestock, and livelihoods have been washed away in the extreme weather event. Climate change is here and now. For many years, land and environmental defenders have been at the front line of defense against the cause and impacts of climate, pollution, and biodiversity crisis. Despite their important role, environmental defenders risk their own life for their advocacy and actions, especially in the Asia-Pacific region. For this session, we will hear from our panelists on trends, challenges, and drivers of attacks against human rights defenders working in the area of climate change and environment protection. We will also discuss concrete recommendations on action need to partner with, support, promote, and protect environmental human rights defenders, and how do business entities integrate them into their operations. To help set the scene, we are honored to have a keynote speech by Ms. Pishimont, Vice Chairperson of the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights. Ms. Pishimont will set the scene on the triple planetary crisis of climate change, pollution, and biodiversity loss, and business and human rights agenda, and the contribution of environmental defenders to support climate action and responsible business practice. Ms. Pishimont, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for that, Romchat, and it gives me so much pleasure to be part of this panel. It is incredibly important that we constantly bear in mind the very real and occurring impacts of global climate change, as well as other forms of environmental degradation that are now taking place all over the world, but also, of course, in the Asia-Pacific region, where countries are very much susceptible to natural disasters and other hazards. To this end, I'm going to try and keep my remarks as short as possible because I would like to hear more from the speakers on this panel, given that they come from diverse backgrounds, practitioner backgrounds, and are, of course, working on the front lines of ensuring that the dialogue on climate change and environmental protection features multi-stakeholder engagement, as well as input from rights holders in particular. To this end, I wanted to bring to everyone's attention the fact that the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights has produced a guidance on respect for human rights defenders. And of course, part of that is respecting environmental human rights defenders who, again, are fighting on the front lines of ensuring that the climate catastrophe that we all face does not come to fruition. At the same time, as part of that guidance, we urged as a working group for businesses to consult human rights defenders as an important expert resource as part of human rights due diligence processes, but also recognizing the role that defenders have to play as important and well-informed watchdogs, advocates, and voices for affected stakeholders. In previous sessions, I had noted how human rights defenders, given that they are on the ground working with communities affected by business-related and climate-related human rights impacts, They are an extremely valuable resource and source of expertise. So in light of that, we need to do more, we need to do better in order to ensure that their voices are front and center of the solutions, of the remedies that we come up with in order to address the broader environmental crisis that we all face. Another point, another recommendation that the working group has put forward as part of that guidance is for states to ensure that the legitimate activities of human rights defenders, and of course, again, this includes environmental human rights defenders, are not obstructed. And of course that they are in fact promoted. And again, this is very much part of the 2 pillars of the UN guiding principles. And this is an area where states in this region can do more on. The final point that I would like to quickly make is that we have to bear in mind that how climate change manifests in the Asia-Pacific region is not uniform, and that the challenges that environmental human rights defenders face in leveraging the levers of change, in putting and raising awareness about these issues will also not be uniform as a result. And this makes the work that they do all the harder. It also means that the difficulties, again, in communicating what is needed and what is at stake also becomes more challenging. And for that reason, we have to recognize that when we talk about environmental human rights defenders, it's not just about climate change. It's also about air pollution. It's also about biodiversity loss. It's also about water contamination. It's also about rivers no longer flowing free. And if we are going to care about the planet, if we are going to care about future generations and their ability to access environmental resources and services, then we have to care about all of these issues and not just climate change. And we have to value all of the environmental human rights defenders working on these issues, not just those on climate change as well. But I'll just stop there. And again, I very much look forward to this panel, and thank you to both OHCHR and UNEP for providing the working group with this opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pishmon, for this very insightful presentation. Before moving to the next segment, let's watch this short video on time to protect environmental rights defenders.
Every human being is born with fundamental rights, and these include environmental rights. An environment that is safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable is the basis for all other rights and freedoms. Environmental defenders are people who use peaceful means to protect our natural resources from overexploitation and to reverse the damage caused by a profit-driven, consumerist society. For example, defenders may be members of rural communities advocating for water access, or others who fight to protect their lands from deforestation in environmentally destructive mega-projects. They also include indigenous peoples who live in harmony with nature and act as guardians of biodiversity. All around the world, a growing number of initiatives have been put in place to address climate change. Students at all levels of education have led protests to denounce the lack of government action in this matter. Because they speak truth to power, land and environmental rights defenders are the most targeted group of human rights defenders. Every year, hundreds of activists are killed, especially in places like Brazil, Mexico, the Philippines, and Colombia, where corruption and impunity fuel such attacks. To make matters worse, conflicts are becoming more and more violent as our natural resources dwindle. Instead of protecting defenders, many governments treat them like terrorists. But environmental defenders are not opposed to progress or development. On the contrary, they value the beauty of the world and are concerned for the long-term future of society. They fight to ensure that our planet is respected and protected for the health of all people. We must recognize their important role and support their cause.
Thank you very much. It is now time to protect environmental human rights defenders. Now we will have a panel discussion on environmental defenders as level of change. I would now like to give the floor to my co-moderators, Dr. Georgina Loy, Regional Coordinator of Environmental and Governance, UN Environment Programs, Asia and the Pacific Office, who will moderate a panel discussion on environmental defenders as levels of change. Georgina, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Romchat. And I am absolutely delighted to be moderating this panel discussion. We have an incredible lineup of speakers, very strong, powerful, knowledgeable women who are joining me on this panel to talk about how we need to protect environmental human rights defenders, how, as Pitchamon said, EHRDs need to be front and center of solutions to the problems that we face, including the triple planetary crisis. Joining me on this panel is Annie Khan, the Acting Asia Regional Manager and South Asia Researcher and Representative of the Business and Human Rights Resource Center. Also, we have Liamai Torres, who is the Executive Director of the Center for Environmental Concerns and Secretariat of the Asia Pacific Network of Environmental Defenders. We have Ms. Wanon Permpimbul, who is the Executive Director of Climate Watch Thailand. I'm also joined by Anna Maria Altop, who is the Head of Development Cooperation Section in the Regional Asia and the Pacific of the Embassy of Sweden in Bangkok. And we are also joined online by Andy Yentriani, who is the chairperson of the National Commission on Violence Against Women, Indonesia, Komnas Perempuan. So first, I would love to turn to Annie. Annie, the Business and Human Rights Resource Center recently released a very important report on human rights defenders and business in 2021, protecting the rights of people driving a just transition. The findings of the report indicates that among the 615 human rights defender attacks linked to business and human rights that were tracked in 2021, nearly 70% were against climate, land, and environmental defenders. And Asia and the Pacific was the most affected region. Could you please tell us more about these findings? What is the scope and the scale of attacks, and specifically, what are the drivers of these attacks?
Thank you so much, Georgina. Thank you, UNEP, OHCHR, for inviting me to be a part of this esteemed panel. It's truly a pleasure to be here. So I do have some slides that I'll refer to. But yeah, just to answer your question about our report and what we've been finding. So to begin with, the Resource Center tracks the human rights records of okay, hopefully it works. Yeah, so the Business and Human Rights Resource Center, we are an international human rights organization, information hub, digital platform. We track the human rights records of over 10,000 companies. We have a number of thematic teams in our organization, one of which is our Human Rights Defenders and Civic Freedoms program, which supports and amplifies the work of human rights defenders focused on business-related activities and seeks to address the root causes or drivers of attacks against human rights defenders linked to company operations and their global supply chains. At the Resource Center, we see human rights defenders really as vital leaders of a just transition to green economies. Human rights defenders raise concerns about risks and harms associated to irresponsible business operations, while also championing sustainable solutions. Yet, it's human rights defenders across the globe that are under continued attack. When we think of transitioning to clean and green energy, the concept itself seems positive, a way to combat climate change, climate breakdown. However, we often forget how it is that we'll actually get there. This rapid scaling up, the commitments that so many countries have made towards net zero carbon goals, all will come at a cost, and largely a human cost. Since 2015, the Resource Center has tracked more than 4,100 attacks against human rights defenders focused on business-related activities. 615 attacks were recorded in 2021 alone. Latin America and Asia Pacific are consistently the two most affected regions when it comes to attacks against defenders. And this past year, from our data, Asia Pacific actually slightly surpassed Latin America as the most dangerous region in the world for human rights defenders carrying out their work. Within the Asia-Pacific region, India and Philippines were the two countries that were found to be the most dangerous and the most number of attacks. We also found that 3 in 5 of the 247 attacks in the Asia-Pacific region were against climate, land, and environmental defenders. So when it comes to the types of attacks that we're seeing in our data, these includes killings, threats, violence, other forms of intimidation that are used to silence human rights defenders and their work. Judicial harassment is actually the most common type of attacks that we saw in the Asia-Pacific region. These include strategic lawsuits against public participation, or SLAPs, which are filed by companies to silence critical voices such as defenders, journalists, and other types of activists. Our global research on SLAPs shows that 63% involve not just civil, but criminal charges as well. And 25% of the SLAPs that we collected, SLAPs cases that we tracked globally, took place in Asia and Pacific. Judicial harassment also involves arbitrary detention and criminalization of defenders who raise concerns about business operations. And if I can just give one example from India, community members in Orissa are facing violence of arrest for peacefully protesting the construction of a large steel plant by a very large steel company. I won't name the company here, but it has been serious concerns have been raised of the environmental and pollution concerns of the steel project. And several human rights defenders have been arrested and been charged with criminal cases for peacefully protesting against this project. This is just one of many, many examples that we have. When we talk about the sectors that we see in our data that we collect, our data shows us that almost every sector comes into play when we talk about attacks against defenders, but it is the 3 most dangerous sectors are actually all natural resource sectors, including mining, agribusiness, logging and lumber, or deforestation. This shows that companies and investors operating in all of these sectors should continue to engage in consultation and take into consideration the needs and security concerns of human rights defenders and communities. So Georgina, when asked, what are the drivers? Our work shows that the attacks are driven mainly by inadequate community consultation, lack of consent for free, prior, and informed consent of Indigenous peoples, racism and discrimination, particularly against Indigenous peoples and ethnic minorities, and the shrinking of civic space that we see across our region. Such restrictions also include freedoms of association restrictions, restrictions of peaceful assembly and expression. So to wrap up, in conclusion, the scale of attacks against human rights defenders reveals a stark absence of stakeholder engagement and effective human rights and environmental due diligence by companies and their investors. So when it comes to recommendations, governments must pass and implement legislation to implement the UNGPs properly, to prevent reprisals, recognizing the vital role of human rights defenders in promoting just and sustainable development. They should consult with human rights defenders at every stage and include human rights defenders in any national action plans or legislation. Companies also must engage and understand the concerns raised by companies in order to conduct robust risk assessments. They should adopt and implement policy commitments to zero tolerance of attacks, engage in human rights and environmental due diligence, and include ongoing consultation as a part of their company processes. Investors also, as an important stakeholder, should leverage their responsible business practices and provide access to remedy to those affected. And today we are actually launching a short briefing on business and human rights defenders in Asia Pacific. There are some physical copies around. There's a QR code on this slide as well. So the 2021 report, global report, which is available in English, French, and Portuguese, and Spanish, was the global report. We also have a short briefing only on the situation in Asia Pacific. So I would invite you all to read that if you can, and I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Annie, for that very important presentation and outline the findings for us of the data that you have been collecting. You also provided a number of key recommendations that can be considered by business actors, by governments, and by others. So now I'm going to turn to Leah, Leah. In 2021, APNED, the Asia Pacific Network of Environmental Defenders, co-organized the Asia Pacific Environmental Human Rights Defender Forum. The forum dedicated sessions to discuss particular issues of EHRDs experiencing or working on particularly thematic issues around some of these key sectors that Annie just explained: mining and extractives, agribusiness, logging, water and dams, industrial and infrastructure development, and air pollution. So Leah, can you share with us what are some of the key takeaways and recommendations from the 2021 EHRD Forum?
Thank you, Georgie. I also have slides, please. Can I borrow that? There. Thank you. So just to give a brief background, the first ever Asia Pacific Environmental Human Rights Defenders Forum was conducted last November 2021. It lasted for 3 days. It was attended by 290 individuals from 73 organizations across the Asia and the Pacific. So what we saw from the sharing of environmental defenders in this forum was that these 3 trends. So first, resource conflict, or when there are external actors like businesses or the government that aim to utilize the natural resources in areas or local communities, and these are often not welcomed. There is development aggression, wherein local communities are asked to accept the projects for so-called national development, despite negative impacts that will happen to them. And there is repression of opposing individuals, organizations, and or communities. So the main issues that emerged was first, in terms of policies, there was a lack of policies, and for those with policies in place, some were flawed, limited, or not implemented. The development framework mostly was profit-oriented and not genuinely towards sustainable development goals. The business and human rights guiding principles were not implemented and upheld in many situations. These led to negative impacts on livelihoods, ways of life, and others. And the negative perception of defenders, they were seen as anti-development, enemies of the state, terrorists, and rebels. And this led to physical and other forms of attacks on defenders. So we also had workshops in this forum, and these were the main recommendations that emerged. So first, to have greater appreciation for environmental human rights defenders. So this means to increase the knowledge and awareness on their situation, because the attacks on environmental defenders are not mostly known. So how do we also show what the importance of their work is, and what's happening to them on the ground? And how do we counter the negative perception about environmental defenders? And second, with regards to knowledge and awareness of human rights standards, treaties, and mechanisms, to increase this knowledge from the local to the international level, and to have education initiated by the government primarily and supported by civil society organizations and international organizations. Next, in terms of policies for protection, access rights, and public participation, for those which are in place already, to improve and strengthen, for those that are lacking these policies, to legislate at the local to the international level. This includes having a regional legally binding policy similar to the Escazú Agreement of Latin America. And next, in terms of business and human rights guiding principles and human rights due diligence, for the UN and governments to ensure that this is followed and implemented, and to ensure an inclusive process in the development of the national action plans on business and human rights. It was also recommended to strengthen relationships among national to international institutions. And for environmental human rights defenders to provide support in terms of capacity development, to improve the skills and knowledge of defenders, to help in connecting with networks, and to provide with financial support. And lastly, to strengthen solidarity, coordination, and collaboration of environmental defenders. So these are the main recommendations and takeaways of the forum. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Leah. And the forum really showed how important it is to have a safe space for EHRDs to share amongst themselves and develop a set of recommendations to support their vital and legitimate work. And we will be hosting, together with civil society partners and UN Human Rights, the 2022 Environmental Human Rights Defender Forum next month. Once again, a safe space for environmental defenders. So now I would like to turn to Wanon. Wanon, you recently joined the 66th session of the Commission on the Status of Women, CSW 66, where the priority theme was achieving gender equality and the empowerment of all women and girls in the context of climate change, environmental, and disaster risk reduction policies and programs. Could you please share with us what are the roles of EHRDs and women environmental defenders in supporting climate action and environmental protection? And also, what are the trends of the challenges and drivers that are attacking women human rights defenders working particularly in these areas of climate and environment protection? Thank you very much, Wanon.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for having me here to share some of the work we have been doing on the ground, and also to share the experiences we had in engaging with the local communities who are defending their rights for climate justice and also climate actions. I would also like us to look into what we mean by climate impacts. So the climate change has been caused by the rising of carbon dioxide. I think we all know about that. And the agricultural sector, which is emitting a lot of methane and also nitrous oxide because of the use of chemical fertilizers, is also somehow protected by the UNFCCC. So that means any climate actions will not do any harm to the food system and agricultural sector. So by mean that you have in this world and also in this country, you know who is the big elephant in the room. So who is really emitting a lot of carbon dioxide, and that means from the energy sector. And if you look into the energy sector, it is the electricity and also the transport sector who's emitting fossil fuels. So with that, so I'm just putting on the frame in terms of who's really, really responsible for the climate catastrophe. And then when you're looking as well at who really, and that is the sector and the gas, who's really causing the climate impacts. So those we have to also think in terms of historical emissions and also the ongoing present emissions, which hasn't been stopped. And we see a number of companies and also businesses and corporates who continue to emit carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and also making the global warming even warmer. And if we don't do anything, the whole world would get into like 3.4 temperature increase from the pre-industrial level. And if our plans to implement what is called the NDC, Nationally Determined Contributions, which is looking one part on emissions reductions, is implemented successfully, we are still having a risk of limiting temperature increase to 1.5. So those are the frame, and what I'm saying is climate change is already a crisis. And we also need to pinpoint who's really causing it. So corporate sectors and also business. And those are also with the whole historical emissions. So when I heard about the business and human rights and business and environment, so my first question would be, is there a real case that a business can also go together with environmental protection? So my answer on that would be that it's not possible. How are you going to engage the private sector who are making profit and who are trying to reduce the capital costs on the expenses of the environment? So that would be something that I am reluctant to somehow coming up with a concrete solutions that you can engage business in a very responsible way, considering the fact that profit making is not going along with environmental protection and reducing of the CO2. And I'm going to give some of the cases, and these cases have been raised by communities who are defending the rights at the community levels. So we are now from Glasgow last year, from the climate negotiations. There was a clear signal from the negotiations that the world is going for net zero, with a number of carbon tradings and also the nature-based solutions. So those are kind of projects that would be in the pipeline in different countries, including in Thailand. My prime minister was announcing the net zero and also carbon neutrality. And with that clear sign from the policy statement, companies are really, really active in doing a lot and changing their policies in order to respond and to welcome the net zero and the carbon neutrality. What is happening with net zero and carbon neutrality is, so if you look, the defenders at the community level were seeing so many active and also interactions between private sectors, companies, and big corporations who are there in their forest areas in order to talk with the community members. If those community members would like to engage in selling the carbon credits from the forest being treated as carbon sequestration. Not to mention that in this country, the government is also trying to reclaim the forested areas and trying to remove communities out of the forest area because they want to keep forests as carbon sinks. So those defenders were saying and also reporting that there are attempts by the private sector who really want to become green and would want to also become carbon neutral and would also like to become doing the net zero. So those would also create a lot of risks to the local communities as well, because the forest is their life. Forest has to be kept according to the private sector, because it has to maintain as the carbon sinks. You cannot really go and cut down the trees or some of the branches. So those communities are defending the rights to keep that forest out of the being part of the net zero and also the carbon neutrality of the private sectors. So many of them were facing intimidation, threats as well, because these are really, really new things. It's not about having one project, a development project in the area, and then there are attacks to the local leaders who are protecting the environment and also trying to stop those projects or development projects that has been elsewhere in Thailand as well. But these are really, really a new trend which is being there. And if you're looking at law, the climate change law, which is being prepared, not yet finalized. So there are rooms for this law to be improved in order to recognize those who are defending the rights for the climate actions and climate solutions, to avoid the false solutions of climate change like net zero and also carbon trading. So I would say that with all those new cases, which is quite new in terms of the climate actions and climate protection, the solutions are not really supporting and also promoting the rights of the community. And we could also foresee what would be happening at the local communities level, and different human rights defenders, especially women who has making use of the forest and also non-timber products in the forest. That would also be, their rights would also be limited. And also if they are really, really coming up forefront against those carbon trading and also net zero, there might be also new ways of threats and being intimidating and also criminalized as well. I think some colleagues here from Indonesia and also from Cambodia, they might want to speak up as well on the criminalization of these false solutions. I think we also need to pay attention to this as well, because it's kind of the new trends. People are talking about climate actions, and business are also talking about climate actions. And those actions are under the frame as green and environmental friendly. But what does it mean by green? Green for whom? So as I said, then with my very first statement, I was really doubtful in terms of engaging the private and also business in the environmental protection and conservation. Because if you're looking at green and also net zero, who really gets the benefits? So it's going to be those businesses as well getting the benefit. So in terms of the systemic barrier and corporate captures, that is not solved. So we are policies that are for the net zero and also the carbon trading is facilitating the way the business are going to benefit and continue making the benefit. So with that, I would end. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Wanun. And you raised some incredibly important points about ensuring that governments and other stakeholders, including business stakeholders, protect and promote environmental rights and use a rights-based approach when seeking solutions to environmental concerns, including climate change, but also other forms of environmental harm. I'm now going to turn to Anna Maria. At the 49th session of the Human Rights Council in March of this year, Sweden organized the high-level event on environmental human rights defenders. The event invited ministers and other participants to reconfirm the international community's commitment to defend and support environmental human rights defenders, and to muster support to increase states' action to promote and protect their rights. Sweden also delivered a joint statement on environmental human rights defenders on behalf of a group of more than 68 countries. And Maria, can you please tell us more on how states and the international community can increase efforts to protect and support environmental human rights defenders?
Thank you. It's really a privilege to be here today to participate in this panel and give some reflections. But let me start by taking this opportunity to thank the UNDP Business and Human Rights team for convening this forum together with a number of UN agencies, including OHCHR, which is also convening this important session. I also want to extend thanks to all our partners who are participating, many of them being representatives of civil society organizations. As we have heard, environmental human rights defenders are under attack. In addition, strategic lawsuits against public participation are increasingly used by companies to silence those voices who share their concerns. This is truly unacceptable. Women environmental human rights defenders often face additional obstacles, risks, and reprisals, including sexual harassment and gender-based violence, both online and offline. Women defenders, especially in rural and indigenous areas, are often at the forefront of environmental movements. But due to gender discrimination, they often lack the resources, contacts, and power to mitigate attacks, which frequently go unreported. There are tools in place to help protect environmental human rights defenders. For example, the Human Rights Council Resolution 4011, recognizing the contribution of environmental human rights defenders to the enjoyment of human rights, environmental protection, and sustainable development. However, here needs to be a stronger commitment by states to hold companies and other stakeholders accountable. States have an obligation to respect, protect, and fulfill the rights of environmental human rights defenders and the communities they represent. Protecting the environment goes hand in hand with protecting the rights of those who defend it. States must also prevent and ensure accountability for attacks, all threats, harassments, and killings. This certainly goes for companies that violate laws. As previously emphasized today in the morning sessions, judicial and non-judicial remedy for adverse human rights impact should be in place and properly implemented. All countries are at times experiencing tensions between environmental human rights defenders and companies, but there are different approaches to addressing this. We need to aim for an environment where companies talk to, involve, and negotiate with CSOs and environmental defenders. Governments can try to facilitate this by protective legislation and by providing platforms for discussions. One example in Sweden is Fossil Free Sweden. This is a platform that was established by the Swedish government and consists of government at different levels, companies as well as civil society organizations that all commit to work for a fossil-free Sweden. Given the situation at hand, we must do what we can to support environmental human rights defenders and improve their protection and their possibilities to access justice. And Sweden is one of the actors supporting this at the global, regional, and national arenas. As Georgina was just saying, Sweden was very much involved in the Human Rights Council, the opening of the Human Rights Council, and we did have a statement on behalf of a group of 68 countries, clearly stating our position, as you just mentioned. To counter the shrinking democratic space, Sweden launched in 2019 a drive for democracy, where we stand up for democratic principles. And one of the priorities in the Swedish government drive for democracy is to protect environmental human rights defenders. The Swedish development cooperation is guided by 5 thematic perspectives. 2 of these are environment and climate and human rights. The other 3 are poverty, gender, and conflict. Sweden strongly believes that integrating and linking different perspectives are key to reach sustainable results and outcomes. The integrated approach between environment and human rights is key in the new regional strategy for Asia and the Pacific. We see that the environmental human rights defenders play a crucial role in promoting and protecting our human and environmental rights. Sweden provides support to several organizations, networks, and initiatives that support environmental human rights defenders at risk and other actors working for democracy and human rights in the Asia-Pacific region. These partner organizations can, for example, provide protection, preventive or emergency support to environmental human rights defenders. The 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development sets out goals for a more sustainable, prosperous, and equitable future. And I believe that the environmental human rights defenders have a vital role to play in supporting states to realize the agenda. Finally, I would like to take this opportunity to thank all participants in this session. I believe that we need to join hands to be much better in protecting and recognizing the contribution of environmental human rights defenders in order to achieve a sustainable future development. They are the eyes and ears on the ground. They are the ones that often experience firsthand environmental deterioration and its impact on the lives of indigenous people and local communities. They are the true champions working on the ground to protect people's human right to a safe, healthy, and sustainable development. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna Maria, and the incredible importance of champion countries in convening those platforms for discussion to scale up commitments of member states and to help hold duty bearers to account for violations against environmental human rights defenders. I'm now going to turn to our final speaker, who is Andy, joining us online, hopefully. Once we get that back. Hi, Andy. Thank you so much for joining us. So the National Commission for the Eradication of Violence Against Women, or Komnas Perempuan, is an independent state body for the enforcement of women's rights in Indonesia. Komnas Perempuan has been actively working on the protection of women environmental human rights defenders in Indonesia. Can you please share with us the support provided to women human rights defenders and how national institutions in Asia Pacific could learn from the experience of Komnas Perempuan? Thank you very much, Andy.
Thank you, Georgina. And I would like to also thank the UNDP and OSCSR for convening this very important discussion. And unfortunately, I couldn't attend directly to this event, but I'm very pleased and honored to be able to also listen and join the discussion through online. Allow me to show you some of the problem first before I actually reach to respond to your questions. If I manage to do screen sharing. Whilst we are working on how to do the screen sharing, I think first of all, I would like to second some of the opinion that has been provided by the previous speakers. Can you go straight to the fourth pages, the fourth page, please? Next slide, please. Next slide. Okay. So in Indonesia, actually, the life to live in a good and healthy living environment is actually constitutionally guaranteed. And in the same time, in Indonesian constitution, it's also recognized and guaranteed the rights to defend rights. And unfortunately, in the same time, you will see in my presentation or in my response that the constitutional guarantee itself does not necessarily being translated into the law comprehensively. Second slide, please. Next slide, please. So I would argue, as being also mentioned by other speakers, the issue of climate change is still inadequately addressed in Indonesia and possibly in other countries. But since climate change is treated more as environmental issue rather than human rights, in the same time, when we actually talk about natural resources based or agrarian conflicts that actually directly has a link or contribute to the deterioration of environment, we mostly do not use the word climate change. The climate change most of the time we'll actually discuss when we are having flood or having a hurricane, etc. Yeah? So it actually weaken the argumentation or the movement itself for climate change and to frame it under human rights discourse. Now, the complication in Indonesia also, there are contradictory policy frameworks regarding sustainable development and also interest for a short-term profit, such as being exemplified by the issuance of job creation law that actually bypass several regulations or provisions that are mandatory according to the law on protection and management of environment that try to put safeguards for the sustainable development itself. However, due to the interest of short-term profits, including this whole argument about to revive after the pandemic COVID-19 actually allows a more relaxed regulation regarding environment to take place. Despite the fact that the Constitutional Court in Indonesia has mandated the parliament and the government to revise the law, the improvement itself has yet to be seen. Now, we actually discussed specifically about the role of women human rights defenders in these environment issues. Unfortunately, in Indonesia, in our reflection on the cases and also challenges faced by women human rights defenders, particularly those working in the environment, most of the time it is put into like two boxes of contradiction. First is the savior of environment, when they are the one who will use the word, who will address the issue as a more soft, not using the words human rights, but more on this environment, green kind of languages. Whilst those who are actually using the framework of human rights will always be boxed as the feline of development, and is actually linked to a more prolonged stigma against women human rights activism in Indonesia that we can trace back to the usage of stigma as Gerwani, which is a women's group back in 1965 that being demonized as a perpetrator of sexual torture against the general. And this accusation is necessary as a Black campaign against communism in the establishment of New Order regime back in 1965. So even to date, the kind of activism utilizing the word human rights can be easily stigmatized as this group, which is considered cruel, inhuman, do not want to actually push for the agenda of the larger population. Hence, utilizing that wording is also being considered as anti-nationalist, and also the backlash of being a feminist. Now, the next slide. This is some of the situation that faced by the human rights groups in Indonesia. As you can see, we actually, as a national human rights institution, we documented cases, and we also opened for the complaints from the community. And in our documentations, most of these natural resources conflicts is actually a prolonged conflict since the New Era time, which is since the early 70s, 80s. And many companies actually claim that they have conducted environmental and social assessment with a participatory consultations. But almost all of the time, the environment and social impacts are actually overlooked. And in the same time, we see how the environmental women human rights defenders are actually leading the rally or leading the strategy making. But in the same time, it put risk to a more general and also gender-based violation and discriminations against them. Can you go to this next slide, please? So we documented 108 cases of women human rights defenders. 60 of them are on psychological attacks and also utilizing cyber attacks that I believe we need to put more attention to besides the cases on physical attacks and also criminalizations as being mentioned by Wan Nun. And in Indonesia, the most common law that being utilized to criminalize environmental women human rights defenders are the utilization of law and electronic information and transactions. So if you are actually put forward your activism through online activism, you may be actually considered as breaching this law. Now, can you go to the next slide, please? I won't go to the detail on this, but if you look at, as being mentioned, the close proximity with the affected community, that actually shape the role of the environment, women, human rights defenders, I believe that there are some areas of priority that we need to put forward. Next slide, please. Because I wouldn't go through the details on the potentials as well as the challenges, as I mentioned already, but I really would like to attract our attention to these two key elements of priority agendas, which is to increase the compliance of human rights principle and the guidelines with raising public awareness to gain more support for the compliance at the state level, and also to decriminalize human rights defenders and to provide an adequate infrastructure to report and investigate the complaints as well as remedies. Because we are talking about the gender vulnerabilities, I think the other priority agendas is actually to strengthen the leadership itself with capacity building and also affirmative actions to women of the most affected within the community, including those of indigenous or other vulnerable groups, and to always do public education to support women's leadership in general. So I think I leave it there for more discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andy. And you've raised, as some of our other speakers have as well, the stigmatizing of environmental human rights defenders is one of the gravest threats facing defenders, and the fact that they are continually being criminalized, threatened, harassed, and murdered across the region for their legitimate and vital work to protect the environment. We need to be clear that environmental human rights defenders have a vital role to play in achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, in supporting governments to meet their legal commitments under multilateral environmental agreements. And it's important to protect the role and the work of environmental human rights defenders through the passing of appropriate laws at the national level. So thank you very much to all of our speakers. We have now some time for questions and answers, and I would like to open the floor for any statements or questions that participants might have. I understand there are a few statements. Yes, so I see a few. So we have one at the back, two at the back. Okay, we have a lot. Okay, I'm going to start over here, if I may. Thank you.
ค่ะชื่อคาติมาลีจานะคะเป็นชนเผ่าลีซูค่ะมาจากเครือข่ายสตรีชนเผ่าแห่งประเทศไทยนะคะขอเป็นตัวแทนของชนเผ่าพื้นเมืองในประเทศไทยแล้วกันนะคะคือสภาพปัญหาที่เราเจออยู่ณตอนเนี้ยด้วยวิถีชีวิตของเราด้วยหลักความเชื่อของเราอะไรเงี้ยเราอยู่กับทรัพยากรธรรมชาติเราเชื่อมกับทรัพยากรธรรมชาติหมดถ้าพี่น้องชาวเลเขาจะมีสารตายายอยู่บนทะเลถ้าพี่น้องลีซูจะมีอัปปะหมุยอยู่ที่ในป่าถ้าพี่น้องกะเหรี่ยงเขาจะมีป่าเดปออยู่ในป่าแต่พื้นที่เหล่านี้ถูกประกาศเป็นเขตป่าแล้วทางใต้ก็ถูกแย่งเลยเนี่ยโดยธุรกิจขนาดใหญ่เราได้รับผลกระทบมากเราไม่สามารถมีชีวิตปกติสุขได้เราถูกคุกคามมากมายแต่สิ่งหนึ่งที่อยากให้ในตัวของ UNGP กับ NAP มีนะคะหรือว่าหลักการของสหประชาชาติก็ได้เราอย่าให้มีหลักความเชื่อของพวกเราอยู่ทุกคนมีโบสถ์ใช่ไหมคะทุกคนมีวัดใช่ไหมมีมุสลิมถ้ามีมุสลิมจะเป็นมัสยิดใช่ไหมคะเราก็มีของเราแบบนี้เราต้องการให้คนยอมรับว่าเรามีแบบนี้เคารพในที่เราเป็นเราแค่ต้องการมีชีวิตของเราเลยเนี่ยอย่างที่สองป่าเป็นชีวิตของเราอย่างลีซูเกิดก็ต้องทำพิธีปามุฮีในเขตป่าใช่ไหมคะตายก็ต้องไปทำพิธีปามุฮีเลยเนี่ยเพราะฉะนั้นคือเราอยู่และเรารักษาทรัพยากรธรรมชาติโดยวิถีชีวิตของเราแต่มันไม่เคยถูกติดตายอยู่ในข้อกฎหมายใดค่ะแต่ณตอนนี้น้ำท่วมก็เราเป็นคนทำทุกอย่างสภาพอากาศร้อนก็เราเป็นคนทำที่จริงเราใช้พลังงานไฟน้อยที่สุดเราไม่มีไฟฟ้าใช้เราไม่ได้จะสร้างถนนในเขตป่าเขาบอกว่าทำไม่ได้เราจะสร้างแท่น้ำเขาบอกว่าทำไม่ได้อันนี้คือสิ่งที่เราเจอนะคะเพราะฉะนั้นก็คืออยากให้ทุกคนเข้าใจว่าเรามีวิถีชีวิตความลำบากยังไงและอย่างที่สองเราถูกยึดที่ดินทำกินเพราะในประเทศไทยเนี่ยป่าที่มันไม่ได้มีเอกสารสิทธิ์คือ36 ล้านไร่อยู่ที่ไหนก็อยู่ในเขตป่าค่ะที่อื่นมันมีเอกสารหมดแล้วแล้วเขาต้องการปลูกป่าอีก 40% ณ ตอนนี้มี 31% แต่เขาต้องการให้เป็น 40% เขาจะไปเอาที่ไหนก็พื้นที่ทำกินของชาวบ้าน ถูกยึดเอาไปปลูกป่าอันนี้คือที่เจออยู่ในเหตุการณ์ของประเทศไทยณตอนนี้นะคะแล้วไม่ได้เจอแค่ลีซูเนาะเกิดเจอทุกกลุ่มคนที่อยู่ในทรัพยากรที่พึ่งพาทรัพยากรเป็นหลักอะไรเงี้ยแล้วณตอนนี้คือที่แรงที่สุดคือพี่น้องบางกลอยเดิมเขาอยู่ไกลใจแผ่นดินเขามีที่ดีของเขาเขาพึ่งพาใส่ชีวิตตัวเองได้แต่เอาพยพเขาออกมาแล้วไปขังเขาไว้อย่างกับเขาเป็นสัตว์ปล่อย7 โมงเช้าปิด5 โมงเย็นเราไม่ได้มีหลักการประกันดูแลอะไรเขาเลยข้างในมีการคุกคามมีการร่วมละเมิดทางเพศเยอะแยะแล้วล่าสุดเขาจะกลับไปที่ใจแผ่นดินคือเขาแค่ต้องการมีชีวิตอยู่ปกติมีที่อยู่มีที่กินมีที่นอนและสามารถเลี้ยงชีพตัวเองได้แค่นั้นเองแต่ว่าณตอนนี้คือให้ไม่ได้ยังไม่พอเขายังถูกขังแล้วเขาพยายามกลับไปที่เดิมของเขาบนใจแผ่นดินเขาก็ถูกอพยพมาอีกตอนนี้เขาก็ถูกขังทั้งที่แก่นการจานเป็นมรดกโลกไปแล้วแต่ว่าคุณภาพชีวิตของคนที่อยู่ในป่าที่รักษาป่ามันยังเป็นสภาพแบบนี้แล้วชาวบ้านที่เขายังจะลุกขึ้นมาต่อสู้มีคดีความค่ะพี่น้องไม่ว่าจะเป็นเด็กผู้หญิงก่อน18อายุ18 ปีเด็กก็เจอแม่อุ้มลูกโดนคดีอะไรอย่างเงี้ยมัน30 กว่าคนน่ะลองคิดดูแล้ววิถีชีวิตแบบนี้เราจะอยู่ยังไงคะหลักการสหประชาชาติมีแนวทางที่จะพอจะช่วยเราได้ไหมเราลำบากมากแล้วยังมีเหมืองอีกกว่านะคะเป็นเหมืองขนาดใหญ่ท่านที่เป็นที่ดินทำกินของเขามันเขตป่าต้นชั้น 1A อย่างดีแต่ในการสัมปทานบอกว่าเป็นป่าเสื่อมโทรมและมีผังน้ำยวมมาอีกดึงแม่น้ำจากสารวินผ่านมากวายเพื่อมาสู่แม่น้ำเจ้าพระยาใครได้ผลประโยชน์เราไม่ได้ผลประโยชน์เข้ามาเคยมาขอฉันธรรมติของเราไหมไม่เคยค่ะเพราะว่า1คนที่สื่อสารได้จะมีแต่รุ่นหน่อยที่อ่านเขียนได้พ่อแม่เราอ่านเขียนไม่ได้เราอยู่ที่บ้านเรามีภาษาของตัวเองเราออกมาข้างนอกเราต้องพยายามที่จะเรียนรู้เพื่อจะเข้าสังคมอะไรอย่างเงี้ยเพราะฉะนั้นสิ่งที่เราเจอก็คืออยากให้มีหลักของความเป็นมนุษย์อยู่ในทุกๆเรื่องอย่าเป็นเน้นที่มูลค่าแต่ให้เน้นของคนคุณค่าของคนเพราะว่ามูลค่าเนี่ยมันไม่มีชีวิตแต่คนเนี่ยมีชีวิตและคนน่ะเป็นคนสร้างมูลค่าเพิ่มขึ้นมาขอบคุณค่ะ
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I now give the floor over here. If
Hello.
I can ask, I know we have very many people who would like to take the floor. Can I ask everyone to please limit their interventions
Hello.
to 2
My
to
name
3
is Ali.
minutes?
I'm from Pakistan. I'm coordinating Sindh Human Rights Defenders Network.
Sorry, your microphone is not turned on, please.
Do you hear me? Nazim Jokhio, who was an environmental journalist in Pakistan, he tried to stop Arab hunters not to kill bustard birds. And when he filmed them, he was subjected to torture, and then he was killed. And when the human rights defenders in the whole Pakistani nation stood with him, that he should get justice. The justification from Pakistani government was that justice to Nazim Jokhio will spoil relationship with Arab countries. So see, the policy, foreign policy is more important than. So my question is to Ambassador, Sweden Ambassador, Her Excellency, that any effort Sweden government has taken, or Sweden Embassy in Pakistan or EU has taken for justice, because still his wife is crying for justice. My second comment will be that such forums are any forum which is happening next month for environmental defenders. Such defenders, at least those who laid their lives for the people, for the environment, should be remembered. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll take a few comments before we respond. So at the back over here.
I, on behalf of indigenous people of Mongdong Songkham, Assam Northeast, would like to mention that in Northeast India, there are many examples of local communities and NGOs members are being arrested for raising their voices against environmental destruction due to coal mining, exploration, and production of oil and gases. For instance, Bagjan oil field in Assam is located in an ecologically very sensitive zone where oil well caught fire. The local activities were arrested under different section of IPC for raising their concern against destruction of lives and environment in the area. But the company responsible for the disaster does not care. even we are also fearing of arrest. In this regard, what mandatory action will you take for protection of human rights defenders in Northeast India? Thank you.
Thank you. We had some hands. Yes.
Hello. Okay. First, we want to tell a translator. You can use I mean ฉัน Okay, please don't mix gender. Okay, I will speak in Thai. โอเคค่ะ คือว่าพิมพ์เนี่ยทำประเด็นเรื่องของบางกอยนะคะ แล้วก็คือบางกอยเนี่ยโดนเจ้าหน้าที่รัฐเนี่ยคุกคามเผาบ้านไปเกือบ100 กว่าหลัง แล้วทีนี้เนี่ยนอกจากนั้นนะคะยังมีประเด็นของการที่รัฐเนี่ยออกกฎหมายเรื่องของการเก็บของป่ามา ซึ่งทำให้ชาวบ้านเนี่ยไม่สามารถที่จะมีอาหารที่ทานได้ แล้วสิ่งที่เกิดขึ้นคือชาวบ้านขาดสารอาหารค่ะ เพราะว่าถ้าเก็บของป่าเนี่ยเท่ากับว่าคุณกำลังโดนคดีจากภาครัฐ ทีนี้มีการเปิดของโรงงานทอผ้าเกิดขึ้น โรงงานทอผ้าก็ให้ค่าแรงที่ไม่เป็นธรรมค่ะ ใช้งานคนชราใช้งานผู้ที่แบบไม่สามารถที่จะทำงานได้ผู้พิการที่เขามีสุขภาพที่ค่อนข้างแย่มากๆแล้วอะค่ะใช้งานหนักมากๆจนทำให้ตอนที่เราขึ้นไปตรวจสุขภาพเนี่ยทุกคนในหมู่บ้านป่วยค่ะ แล้วก็ให้ค่าแรงไม่เป็นธรรมนะคะ คือมีการถึงไม่ให้ค่าแรงบางเดือนก็มีค่ะ นอกจากนั้นนะคะนอกจากรัฐที่จะทำอย่างนี้บนบางกอยแล้วเนี่ยตอนที่ชาวบ้านเนี่ยมาเรียกร้องความยุติธรรมที่กรุงเทพก็โดนรัฐเอาคดียัดป่าค่ะวันที่27นี้ค่ะเรามาดูกันนะคะว่ารัฐไทยจะสั่งฟ้องหรือเปล่าค่ะฝากUNจับตามองด้วยนะคะแล้วนอกจากนั้นนะคะถ้าที่ทำคดีบางคนที่อยู่ในบางกอยเนี่ยจะรู้จักกันดีคือบิลลี่พอลิจีรักจงเจริญค่ะบิลลี่เนี่ยโดนอุ้มหายแล้วตอนนี้นะคะชัยวัฒน์เป็นผู้ต้องหาแต่คดีของเขาเนี่ยไม่คืบหน้าเงียบหายไปแล้วก็ไม่มีการอัปเดตใดๆเป็นเรื่องที่เราอยากให้จับตามองอีกเรื่องหนึ่งค่ะเพราะว่าพิมพ์เนี่ยออกมาพูดเรื่องนี้เรื่องของการคนที่โดนอุ้มหายเรื่องของบิลลี่แต่พิมพ์ถูกคุกคามถูกตัดสายเบรกรถส่วนตัวของพิมพ์เองถูกเอาถึงชีวิตถูกขู่ฆ่านี่คือสิ่งที่เราได้รับค่ะนี่คือสิ่งที่เราออกมาปกป้องใจแผ่นดินปกป้องชาวบ้านปกป้องความยุติธรรมนี่คือสิ่งที่นักปกป้องสิทธิ์ในเมืองไทยโดนค่ะอยากให้ทางสหประชาชาติเนี่ยรู้ไว้อย่างหนึ่งว่ารัฐไทยเนี่ยมันมีกฎหมายแต่กฎหมายเนี่ยมันใช้ไม่ได้จริงทั้งพฤตินัยและนิตินัยเขากำลังจะฆ่าเราและพวกเรากำลังจะตายทั้งนักกิจกรรมและชาวบ้านทุกคนกำลังจะตายค่ะแต่ว่าไม่มีอะไรที่จะมาปกป้องเราได้จริงๆเลยขอบคุณค่ะ
Thank you. Okay, we have one more here. Sorry, can we turn off the other mic just so there's not echo? Yeah, thank you.
ค่ะที่พวกคุณพูดถึงการปกป้องชุมชนพื้นเมืองและนักปกป้องสิทธินะก็มีเรื่องอยากเล่าให้ฟังการพวกเราเนี่ยถูกฟ้องดำเนินคดีเรียกค่าเสียหายจากการทำให้โลกร้อนและถูกจำคุกจากการปกป้องพื้นที่ดินทำกินของตัวเองรัฐบาลไทยเนี่ยออกกฎหมายใช้เงินจาก World Bank เนี่ยมาทำกฎหมายเพื่อที่จะลดโลกร้อนแต่ว่ารัฐบาลไทยเนี่ยก็เอามาทำนโยบายทวงคืนผืนป่าให้มาใช้กับคนในชุมชนชายขอบแม้กระทั่งกะเหรี่ยงหรือว่าชาติพันธุ์เนี่ยก็ถูกนโยบายทวงคืนผืนป่าเนี่ยกฎหมายของรัฐบาลไทยเนี่ยกำลังจะทำให้พวกเราที่เป็นชุมชนชายขอบและพื้นเมืองเนี่ยสูญเสียที่ดินทำกินแล้วก็พวกเราเนี่ยยังถูกเรียกร้องค่าเสียหายเนี่ยจากการทำให้โลกร้อนเนี่ย14 คนเนี่ยเป็นเงิน4 ล้านบาทในการทำให้โลกร้อนทั้งที่ข้อเสนอในเชิงนโยบายของพวกเราต่อรัฐบาลไทยเนี่ยคือการจัดการแผนทรัพยากรโดยชุมชนแต่ภายใต้กฎหมายของรัฐบาลเนี่ยรัฐบาลได้เขียนโครงการว่าต้องอยู่ภายใต้โครงการอนุรักษ์ของรัฐบาลเท่านั้นนี่คือการจำกัดสิทธิของชุมชนสิทธิของชาวบ้านเนี่ยไม่มีสิทธิ์อะไรเลยเราไม่สามารถที่จะต่อรองกับรัฐบาลไทยได้เลยในการเขียนกฎหมาย
Thank you. Thank you. We only have time for one
Yeah.
more intervention. I am very sorry, but unfortunately, we do have to finish after this. And at
Yeah,
the-
thank you. My name is Micheline Salata. I am representing the Indigenous Youth Front of the Archipelago in Indonesia. And we have more than 2,499 indigenous communities in Indonesia, which is now not acknowledged by the government of Indonesia up until now. We have been fighting for 30 years for our rights to be recognized. The resistance that has been undergone by the indigenous peoples are to lodge a formal complaint. We have taken legal actions and we have conduct peaceful protest in order for us to take away what's ours, to reclaim the indigenous communities that we have. But what we experience inside our community is that we are being oppressed, we are being captured, and we are being jailed and imprisoned without doing anything wrong. And from all these efforts, loss of the indigenous people's life has been resulted in almost zero result, in which indigenous peoples also still lost their home and life. And it means no lands from the deforestation. It means that there will be a lot of flood in everywhere. Now that what makes it difficult in our country, that even though that we have fight a lot, what makes it difficult is that because the current law in Indonesia has caused the indigenous peoples to lose their land. Why is that so? Because legally the land of the indigenous peoples, which is originally owned by the hundreds of years of indigenous peoples management, is considered to be owned by the government. And this is how corrupted it is in our country. And right now, I want to mention some of the important indigenous communities that has been oppressed in Indonesia, which is located in Sihaporas in Sumatra, Rendu in East Nusa Tenggara, Kinipan in Central Kalimantan, Paniai in Papua, Wahoni in Southeast Sulawesi, and Sintang in Central Kalimantan. All of these people have to undergo a lawsuit because they are protecting their lands. The Human Rights Commissions in Indonesia and its commissioner have stated that the recognition of the indigenous peoples should be able to navigate from the international declarations of the human rights. Because all of these cases still happening, we want to demand and ask questions to UN and everyone. What's the best mechanism to push the implementation to the national level, especially in our country? We want to hear from all of the UN about the possible solutions, since relying to our government is not going to save the remaining forests and the lives of the indigenous peoples in our country. Thank you. Kurre sumanga. Adil Catalino Bacoramin Kasaruga Basengat Kajubata. Arus, arus, arus.
Thank you very much.
Sorry, can I just add? Sorry. Sorry.
We really do.
Can I
have
just
to
add
finish.
to my friend, because I'm also indigenous people from Cambodia. I just to announce that
2 minutes.
there are 81 IPHRD was harassed, were accused by the company and the government, and including 15 women there. They are faced a lot of discrimination to the government. They don't implement the law. We have the law that respect our right, but it was not implemented by the government. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you to all of our speakers on this panel. And I would really like to thank everyone in the audience for all of those interventions. They're all incredibly important. And we have taken note of them. We unfortunately really do need to close the session. I am very sorry for those of you who did not get a chance to intervene, but there will be more chances over the next 2 days. There are more sessions tomorrow. There's a session first thing in the morning on environmental issues again, and there is another session in the second part of the morning also on environmental issues and plastics. So please do also join those sessions and raise your concerns and issues and thoughts in those sessions. So once again, thank you for joining. Thank you to all of our speakers, and have a lovely rest of today.